peaceful as some immeasurable plain, by the first beams of dawning light impressed. In the calm sunshine slept the glittering main. The very ocean has its hour of rest, that comes not to the human mourner's breast. Remote from man, and storms of mortal care, a heavenly silence did the waves invest. I looked, and looked along the silent air, until it seemed to bring a joy to my despair. Welcome to the Troubadour Podcast. Today we'll be reading The Female Vagrant by William Wordsworth. Now, this is a special poem he originally wrote in 1793 during the Reign of Terror in France. Now, he had already visited France, fell in love with a French woman named Annette Vallon, had a child, went back to Britain due to the war between Britain and France. He wrote vehemently against the war, although he didn't publish everything he wrote, but he was adamantly on the side of the Republicans, those fighting against the crown, not because he was necessarily against the crown, but because he was for the individual person, Frenchman, fighting for their liberty. Now, one day, he and a friend, Calvert, made their way towards Salisbury on a walking tour. And suddenly, the horse, William Wordsworth's horse, and the carriage broke down, and he was forced to walk, and Calvert had his horse. They decided to separate because Wordsworth wanted to continue the walking tour, and Calvert went away another direction. For 2 or 3 days, William wandered alone over Salisbury Plain. It was a period of intense introspection, heightened by the bleak aspect of a landscape, which seemed like a metaphor for his own aimlessness. He roamed, quoting from the prelude, "There on the pastoral downs, without a track to guide me, or along the bare white roads lengthening in solitude their dreary line." Now, 50 years later, he would declare that this was, quote, "my ramble over many parts of Salisbury Plain left upon my mind imaginative impressions, the force of which I have felt to this day. I recommend, if you, like me, have never been to Salisbury Plain, that you look up some images. What's interesting is that it is a very desolate area in England. It is the home of Stonehenge and many very ancient artifacts and pieces and relics of civilization. And this, of course, with the events in 1793 and his experiences, during the French Revolution, are impacting his consciousness and his thoughts of this budding poet, this poet who is on the verge of changing the entirety of English poetry. And it reflects on him and it impacts him intensely. At Stonehenge, despite the solemnity of his surroundings, he was overcome with heat and fatigue and fell asleep in the stone circle. As he later remarked ironically to a friend, in such a place he ought to have been visited by the muse in his slumbers, but he was not. Nevertheless, landscape, antiques, and political conviction were all drawing together in his mind to produce a poem, The Female Vagrant, originally the Salisbury Plain poem. The object of The Female Vagrant, which is a part of that, which it was taken out of the Salisbury Plain poem and expanded into its own poem for lyrical ballads several years later in 1798. So he wrote the poem in 1793 initially, and then rewrote it and expanded it and edited it for the lyrical ballads in 1793. So the object of the female vagrant was in part to expose the vices of the penal law and the calamities of war as they affect individuals. Informed by personal experience, inspired by compassion, and articulated by rage, he had found a voice at last. And this is really when I think Wordsworth finds his actual voice. He has published before, but this is the first time when he really gets into his own and the uniqueness of William Wordsworth's meter, his language. What you're going to hear in the poem itself is it is all very normal language. There are a few words you may not know, but for the most part, they're all words you know. And of course, he messes with the syntax a little bit, and that's just a poetic, necessity sometimes for the meter. And also, it's done on purpose in order to jar you out of your normal way of thinking. The story is a ballad, so it is a story. The poem is a ballad, I should say. So it is a story. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a general idea of the story structure or what's going on in the story. So you have a scaffolding when you hear the poem, and then afterwards we'll go stanza by stanza. Now the poem is about 18 minutes to read, so it's not as long as the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I did last week, which was about 45 minutes to read. So it's much shorter, but it's about, maybe 30 stanzas or something like that. Okay, so here's a little synopsis, a very brief one. So the female vagrant tells the story of the accidental meeting of two wanderers seeking shelter during a stormy night on Salisbury Plain. The woman explained how she came to be alone and destitute. Her father had been evicted from his cottage in the lakes by an acquisitive neighbor, kind of an industrialist. She had married, but the advent of war had ruined them, and in a last desperate attempt to support her and their 3 children, he had volunteered for the army. Now, the army that we're going to talk about this after the poem, but the army and the war is not the French Revolution in the 1798 lyrical ballads, or at least it's not made to be seen that way. It has a much more abstract feeling to it, as though it could, be any war, but it seems pretty indicative that it is actually the war against America, the American, the war of how the British would have seen it, the war of the rebel colonials. And so, that's the war that takes away the husband of this woman. Okay, so let me continue real quick. Within a year, she was the sole survivor. She lost husband and children to sword and plague. So this is a tale of suffering. It's a tale of intense suffering, and we're going to talk about also the narrative form that it takes. And it's a really important poem for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons that I think many of you may be aware of is if you read romantic novels and stories of the 19th century, take, for instance, in particular, Victor Hugo, you will see this kind of story of the abandoned woman and child, abandoned by husband, society, by something, by church, by her friends, whoever it is. You'll see this played out over and over and over again. And this is the first one. And this is what it means that William Wordsworth really ushers in the Romantic era in many ways. He and Wordsworth, they really represent 2 strains of what is going on in the Romantic Revolution in poetry, is that Wordsworth here is using the common language of common people, and he's looking at common people. But the thing that he's doing that's romantic is he's taking it and he's coloring it with imagination. His goal is not to write some cliche, superficial view of a hero and a heroine, just going out and fighting a war, which there's nothing wrong with heroes and heroines. But a lot of times before Wordsworth, in poetry and epic poetry, besides some of the great ones, of course, like the Miltons and the Chaucers, and of course those are classics that he loved. But even there, you're getting a little bit of this like broad strokes of this whole story, and the characters take a back seat. The individuals take a back seat, even with the classics like the Aeneid and Homer, and even with Milton, you're not getting as much of the inner psychology of what is going on in the lives of the individuals in the stories. Wordsworth was really interested in the what he called tracing the excitements, the pleasures, and these in a state of excitement, the intense emotions felt by individual humans. And in this case, a distraught woman who is telling a story to another wanderer in Salisbury Plain or at Stonehenge. You can picture Stonehenge, and it's raining. Now, that's not in the poem we're going to read. There's none of that, actually. He cut that, the aspect of the two meeting. But we're going to talk about that might help you with the narration, that it's mostly a woman talking, but there is about 4 lines from somebody else that kind of helps to frame the entirety of the poem. So let's read the poem and, have as much time for that. And then we will do a stanza by stanza breakdown afterward to kind of talk about the structure, the meaning, what's happening in the poem, and why it's important to us today. So enjoy The Female Vagrant. The Female Vagrant by William Wordsworth. By Derwent's side my father's cottage stood, the woman thus her artless story told. One field, a flock, and what the neighboring flood supplied, to him were more than mines of gold. Light was my sleep, my days in transport rolled. With thoughtless joy I stretched along the shore my father's nets, or watched, when from the fold, high over the cliffs, I led my fleecy store. A dizzy depth below, his boat and twinkling oar. My father was a good and pious man, an honest man by honest parents bred, and I believe that, soon as I began to lisp, he made me kneel beside my bed, and in his hearing there my prayers I said. And afterwards, by my good father taught, I read, and loved the books in which I read. For books in every neighboring house I sought, and nothing to my mind a sweeter pleasure brought. Can I forget what charms did once adorn my garden, stored with peas and mint and thyme, and rose and lily for the Sabbath morn? The Sabbath bells and their delightful chime, the gambols and wild freaks at shearing time, my hen's rich nest through long grass scarce espied, the cowslip gathering at May's dewy prime, the swans that, when I sought the waterside, from far to meet me came, spreading their snowy pride. The staff I yet remember which upbore the bending body of my active sire, his seat beneath the honeyed sycamore when the bees hummed, and chair by winter fire. When market morning came, the neat attire with which, though bent on haste, myself I decked, my watchful dog, whose starts of furious ire, when stranger passed, so often I have checked, the red breast known for years, which at my casement pecked. The suns of 20 summers danced along. Ah, little marked how fast they rolled away. Then rose a mansion proud, our woods among, and cottage after cottage owned its sway. No joy to see a neighboring house, or stray through pastures not his own, the master took My father dared his greedy wish gainsay. He loved his old hereditary nook, and ill could I the thought of such sad parting brook. But when he had refused the proffered gold, to cruel injuries he became a prey, sore traversed in whate'er he bought and sold. His troubles grew upon him day by day, till all his substance fell into decay. His little range of water was denied. All but the bed where his old body lay, all, all was seized, and weeping, side by side, we sought a home where we uninjured might abide. Can I forget that miserable hour when from the last hilltop my sire surveyed, peering above the trees, the steeple tower that on his marriage day sweet music made? Till then he hoped his bones might there be laid, close by my mother in their native bowers. Bidding me trust in God, he stood and prayed. I could not pray. Through tears that fell in showers, glimmered our dear loved home. Alas, no longer ours. There was a youth whom I had loved so long, that when I loved him not I cannot say. Mid the green mountains many and many a song we two had sung, like little birds in May. When we began to tire of childish play, we seemed still more and more to prize each other. We talked of marriage and our marriage day, and in truth did love him like a brother, for never could I hope to meet with such another. His father said that to a distant town he must repair, to ply the artist's trade. What tears of bitter grief, till then unknown! What tender vows our last sad kiss delayed! To him we turned, we had no other aid. Like one revived, upon his neck I wept, and her whom he had loved in joy, he said he well could love in grief. His faith he kept, and in a quiet house once more my father slept. 4 years each day with daily bread was blessed, by constant toil and constant prayer supplied. 3 lovely infants lay upon my breast, and often, viewing their sweet smiles, I sighed, and knew not why. My happy father died, when sad distress reduced the children's meal. Thrice happy, that from him the grave did hide, the empty loom, cold hearth, and silent wheel, and tears that flowed for ills which patience could not heal. 'Twas a hard change, an evil time was come. We had no hope, and no relief could gain. But soon, with proud parade, the noisy drum beat round, to sweep the streets of want and pain. My husband's arms now only served to strain me and his children hungering in his view. In such dismay, my prayers and tears were vain. To join those miserable men he flew, and now to the sea-coast with numbers more we drew. There foul neglect for months and months we bore, nor yet the crowded fleet its anchor stirred. Green fields before us and our native shore, by fever from polluted air incurred, ravage was made, for which no knell was heard. Fondly we wished, and wished away, nor knew, mid that long sickness and those hopes deferred, that happier days we never more must view. The parting signal streamed, at last the land withdrew. But from delay the summer calms were past. On as we drove, the equinoctial deep ran mountains high before the howling blast. We gazed with terror on the gloomy sleep of them that perished in the whirlwind's sweep, untaught that soon such anguish must ensue. Our hopes such harvest of affliction reap, that we the mercy of the waves should rue. We reached the western world, a poor, devoted crew. Oh, dreadful price of being to resign all that is dear in being! Better far in want's most lonely cave, till death to pine, unseen, unheard, unwatched by any star. Or in the streets and walks where proud men are, better our dying bodies to obtrude, than dog-like, waiting at the heels of war, protract a cursed existence, with the brood that lap their very nourishment, their brother's blood. The pains and plagues that on our heads came down, disease and famine, agony and fear, in wood or wilderness, in camp or town, it would thy brain unsettle even to hear. All perished, all in one remorseless year, husband and children, one, by sword and ravenous plague, all perished. Every tear dried up, despairing, desolate, on board a British ship I waked, as from a trance restored. Peaceful as some immeasurable plain, by the first beams of dawning light impressed. In the calm sunshine slept the glittering main. The very ocean has its hour of rest, that comes not to the human mourner's breast. Remote from man and storms of mortal care, a heavenly silence did the waves invest. I looked and looked along the silent air, until it seemed to bring a joy to my despair. Ah, how unlike those late terrific sleeps and groans that rage of racking famine spoke, where looks inhuman dwelt on festering heaps, the breathing pestilence that rose like smoke, the shriek that from the distant battle broke, the mine's dire earthquake, and the pallid hosts driven by the bomb's incessant thunderstroke to loathsome vaults, where heart-sick anguish tossed. Hope died, and fear itself in agony was lost. Yet does that burst of woe congeal my frame, when the dark streets appeared to heave and gape, while like a sea the storming army came, and fire from hell reared his gigantic shape, and murder by the ghastly gleam and rape seized their joint prey, the mother and the child. But from these crazing thoughts my brain escape. For weeks the balmy air breathed soft and mild, and on the gliding vessel heaven and ocean smiled. Some mighty gulf of separation past, I seemed transported to another world. A thought resigned with pain, when from the mast the impatient mariner the sail unfurled, and whistling, called the wind that hardly curled the silent sea. From the sweet thoughts of home, and from all hope I was forever hurled. For me, farthest from earthly port to roam was best, could I but shun the spot where man might come. And oft, robbed of my perfect mind, I thought at last my feet a resting place had found. Here will I weep in peace, so fancy wrought, roaming the illimitable waters round. Here watch, of every human friend disowned, all day my ready tomb the ocean flood. To break my dream the vessel reached its bound, and homeless near 1,000 homes I stood, and near 1,000 tables pined and wanted food. By grief enfeebled was I turned adrift, helpless as sailor cast on desert rock, nor morsel to my mouth that day did lift, nor dared my hand at any door to knock. I lay, where with his drowsy mates the cock from the cross timber of an outhouse hung. How dismal tolled that night the city clock. At morn my sick heart hunger scarcely stung, nor to the beggar's language could I frame my tongue. So passed another day, and so the third. Then did I try, in vain, the crowd's resort. In deep despair, by frightful wishes stirred, near the seaside, I reached a ruined fort. There, pains which nature could no more support, with blindness linked, did on my vitals fall. Dizzy my brain, with interruptions short, of hideous sense, I sunk, nor step could crawl, and thence was borne away to neighboring hospital. Recovery came with food, but still my brain was weak, nor of the past had memory. I heard my neighbors, in their beds, complain of many things which never troubled me, of feet still bustling round with busy glee, of looks where common kindness had no part, of service done with careless cruelty, fretting the fever round the languid heart, and groans, which, as they said, would make a dead man start. These things just served to stir the torpid sense, nor pain nor pity in my bosom raised. Memory, though slow, returned with strength, and thence dismissed, again on open day I gazed, at houses, men, and common light, amazed the lanes I sought, and as the sun retired, came, where beneath the trees a faggot blazed. The wild brood saw me weep, my fate inquired, and gave me food and rest, more welcome, more desired. My heart is touched to think that men like these, the rude earth's tenants, were my first relief. How kindly did they paint their vagrant ease, and their long holiday that feared no grief. For all belonged to all, and each was chief. No plough their sinews strained, no grating road, no wain they drove, and yet the yellow sheaf in every vale for their delight was stowed. For them, in nature's meads, the milky udder flowed. Semblance, with straw and panniered ass, they made, of potters wandering on from door to door, but life of happier sort to me portrayed, and other joys my fancy to allure. The bagpipe, dining on the midnight moor, in barn uplighted, and companions boon well met from far with revelries secure, in depth of forest glade, when jocund June rolled fast along the sky his warm and genial moon. But ill it suited me, in journey dark o'er moor and mountain, midnight theft to hatch, to charm the surly house dog's faithful bark, or hang on tiptoe at the lifted latch. The gloomy lantern, and the dim blue match, the black disguise, the warning whistle shrill, and ear still busy on its nightly watch, were not for me, brought up in nothing ill. Besides, on grief so fresh my thoughts were brooding still. What could I do, unaided and unblessed? Poor father, gone was every friend of thine, and kindred of dead husband are at best small help, and, after marriage such as mine, with little kindness would to me incline. Ill was I then for toil or service fit, with tears whose course no effort could confine. By highway side forgetful would I sit whole hours, my idle arms in moping sorrow knit. I lived upon the mercy of the fields, and oft of cruelty the sky accused, on hazard or what general bounty yields, now coldly given, now utterly refused. The fields I for my bed have often used, but what afflicts my peace with keenest ruth is that I have my inner self abused, foregone the home delight of constant truth, and clear and open soul, so prized in fearless youth. 3 years a wanderer, often have I viewed in tears the sun towards that country tend where my poor heart lost all its fortitude. And now across this moor my steps I bend. Oh, tell me whither, for no earthly friend have I. She ceased, and weeping turned away, as if because her tale was at an end, she wept, because she had no more to say of that perpetual weight which on her spirit lay. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing that as much as I enjoyed reading that. Now, just to get us started, when it opens by Derwin's side, my father's cottage stood, she's talking about where she used to live. Derwin's side is a location. These are locations I've never been to. I'm not familiar with England, so you'd have to look that up. And it's not super important, the location, except I think it's an area in the Lake District where Wordsworth lives. But even that's not that important at this moment. What's really important is that it starts in a location. And it starts in a location in two senses that is going to be important. One sense is that it's a physical location where she's from. More importantly, it's a state. She's in a state, and she's going to leave this state and try to come back and never succeed. It's a journey, but it's also a physical journey. So this is what you might think of in a novel as a plot and, a character arc. There's these events that goes on, and the character is experiencing something along with it. I mean, this has an impact on novels that is very intense, because the plot and the events that go on represent what's happening in her inner world, represents what's happening in her inner world. So they're not chaotic. It's not the events, affecting, it's not she's just thrown around from event to event randomly and she's the same person kind of dealing with these different things. Maybe she learned something new here or there. It's that they are completely in cahoots, combination. They're integrated totally, where her mind is in one place, and it's, when she goes on the journey to America to follow her husband, the waters are choppy and men go down and die. And eventually, and soon thereafter, her husband dies of sword and her children die of sword and plague. On the way back, everything's peaceful, which kind of she has gained a kind of despairing peace where she's not screeching and yelling. She's just despairing. And there's that line that I read at the beginning of the poem. I looked and looked along the silent air until it seemed to bring a joy to my despair. So there's kind of a silence in her inner world that is also reflected in the outer world. So you see, if you know anything about novels of the 19th century, especially if you followed Ayn Rand and her view of what makes a good plot, is that there's an integration of the character and the events of the story, that they're not separated. It's not like the character is just kind of acting in the world separate from the events, or the events are kind of just acting and throwing the character around. It's that they are truly integrated. And that's an example, is the waves, the choppiness of the waves on the way there, and choppiness, and the calmness on the way back when everyone's dead. And that is, present in this whole story. I mean, this is a groundbreaking poem, the Salisbury Plain poem. And in this case, the Female Vagrant that he wrote for, he took this out of the Salisbury Plain poem and he expanded it for the 1798 version. Okay, so we're in a location. And it is, so it begins by a woman telling the story of her life, and it is artlessly. So there's an aside. If you go to troubadourmag.com, you'll see the poem itself. And it says, by Derwin's side, my father's cottage stood, parentheses, the woman thus her artless story told. So that's an indication that there's someone else there. Wordsworth did that on purpose. He wanted you to know there was someone else, but he didn't want to give that person a lot of voice and technique and talking. He did that in the Salisbury Plain poem, though. But in this poem, he wants the woman to tell her story. And this is an important part of the narrative here of what we're doing and getting into this woman in a state of excitement. And we're tracing what's going on in her inner world. That's Wordsworth's line in his view of what he's trying to do. So she's telling her artless story. And we're going to get into why it's artless. And there is kind of a cliche. I want you to think about the cliche of women who can't tell their stories. They can't keep their story straight. They're over here, they're over there. There's a couple other things that we're getting in this particular poem where, when she if it was confusing whether or not she got married to her childhood boyfriend, or if she married someone else and he left, I think that's intentional. I'm pretty sure it is pretty confusing. I've read it numerous times and I am still missing whether he left or not. It's a little unclear. But we'll come to that when we get there. You'll see that there is actually a purpose behind why he did that. Okay, so she, begins this first stanza with a description of her father's cottage where she grew up. And she had a very quaint, idyllic life. And if you picture these romantic paintings and these beautiful, idyllic paintings of the past before big bad industrialization came in and destroyed everything, it's just shepherds and farmers living in harmony with nature. And that's what he's kind of drawing here. My father's nets. Light was my sleep, my days in transport rolled. With thoughtless joy I stretched along the shore my father's nets, or watched, when from the fold high o'er the cliffs I led my fleecy store, that's her sheep, a dizzy depth below, right? She's high up on a hill or something. His boat in twinkling oar, and he's out fishing. So it's this very idyllic type of a scene that she's setting up. Now, in the second stanza, she talks about her piousness, and this is going to take place later or be of importance later in the story. They were pious religious people, and the young girl was a lover of reading, gaining much pleasure from it. Right? I read and loved the books in which I read. For books in every neighboring house I sought, and nothing to my mind a sweeter pleasure brought. So she's a reader. She's a peasant. She's not rich or anything, but she has something. She's not completely poor, and she has God in her life, or her view of, or the peasant's view of God, and being pious, honest people. This is going to be important. In the third stanza, she talks about she will never forget all the charms of this idyllic life: the garden, roses, lilies, for Sabbath, the bells, right? My garden stored with peas and mint and thyme, and rose and lily for the Sabbath morn, the Sabbath bells and their delightful chime, the gambols and wild freaks at shearing time. This is just a reference to the way that sheep and such will jump around when it's time to shear their, their coats. So the next stanza is, she recalls her father as he aged, bending body, right? She puts it, the staff I yet remember which upbore the bending body of my active sire, her father, the guy who sired her. And she remembers on market days how he wore his neat attire, and even the family dog attended, my watchful dog who starts a furious ire when stranger passed, so often I have checked. She had to check his furious starts, right? When he's barking at these people and they're trying to sell stuff to him or talk to strangers, and this dog is barking. So it's, she stops him from barking. So it's, again, she's painting in 1, 2, 3. There was 4 stanzas, this absolutely perfect life. Fifth stanza. The sons of 20 summers danced along, right? So she's been alive for 20 years probably, and she lived her life 20 years. Ah, little marked how fast they rolled away. Then rose a mansion proud our woods among, and cottage after cottage owned its sway. What does that mean? Well, they went on for 20 years in this beautiful, perfect, harmonious way of living, when all of a sudden a large mansion gobbled up cottage after cottage. You could think of this as a commercialized farm. This new master took is the word she uses, through pastures not his own, the master took. My father dared his greedy wish gainsay, basically means denied. So the man wanted the land of her father, and he said no. He loved his old hereditary nook. So her father loved the place where he came from. This is the place where his father lived, and his father's father lived, and so on and so forth for who knows how many generations. And it's his, and he's going to pass it on to his daughter and her husband. That's the whole point. But this greedy industrialist, if you know me, I don't agree with that. But we have to get into the story of Wordsworth and see where he's coming from. So we have this bad guy that's trying to take all that away from them. Next stanza. After refusing the industrialist's money, right, it says, but when he had refused the proffered gold, the father becomes prey to many troubles. He could no longer get anything sold. His crops rotted. The range of water he had relied on was denied to him. So this is actually an aside, an asterisk that Wordsworth wrote. So it says in the poem, his little range of water was denied, asterisk. And this is what Wordsworth wrote at the bottom of Lyrical Ballads on this page. Several of the lakes in the north of England are let out to different fishermen in parcels marked out by imaginary lines drawn from rock to rock. So he was very adamant against the use of imagination in certain senses, it it infuriated him to some degree, or it did infuriate him, that you could just put a mark on a map and these people who've lived there for hundreds of years no longer had access to the woods where they used to hunt and, um, you know, gather wood. And he has a poem in here that I've read already to you called The Thorn, about an old woman who is, going out into the woods to gather some thrush and some woods so that she can stay warm in the winter. And the new owner, because now they've sold the rights essentially to these areas, the new owner rejects her, kicks her out, but then she curses him and he is incapable of getting warm ever again for the rest of his life until he dies. And so Wordsworth is very interested in this whole idea of this ancient, these people have been here for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, living this way. And then all of a sudden you're going to draw this line and cut them out, right? And I understand, I'm very pro industrialization, but this is a problem. This is a difficult thing. Like, you can't just expect these people to easily, get over it. And that if you're an individualist, it should matter to you because their lives do matter. And this is why the revolutions in Europe and Britain were so difficult. And it was, even though it was difficult in America, but not in the same way, because you had thousands of years of living a certain way. And then you just had to interrupt it. And that's what he's reacting against. And it's a legitimate thing to react against. Okay, so basically debt collectors get everything from the father except for his bed, his deathbed. It actually is. And then they have to move. Now, the 7th stanza, he says, basically, this was a miserable time when her father was evicted from the land he believed he would die in. Then he marked and believed he would die. He remained steadfast in his belief in God, but she was too emotionally struck to pray and to believe in God anymore. She wavers a little bit. It's said here in the poem itself, I could not pray through tears that fell in showers, glimmered our dear loved home, alas, no longer ours. But I think, something's going on with her. She's having a little bit of wavering of faith. Now, in the next stanza, and this is where I think it gets into the artless tale told, right? Like the story, her artless story told comes along here. There was a youth whom I had loved so long. So, all of a sudden she's going back and saying, so it's like she's telling this story. She's saying, hey, we got kicked out. Oh, by the way, 8 years before that, or 10 years before that, I had met a young boy, or, we fell in love, and when we were old enough, we were talking about marriage, so it's like, when is that happening? Why are you throwing that in all of a sudden? And that's kind of the artless story, but it's important in the way that Wordsworth is doing this. So she has lost her home, and that reminds her, in the telling of this story, in the actual narrative of the poem, while she's talking to this man on Salisbury Plain at Stonehenge, she tells the story and she says, they lost their home. And then she talks about another home. So that's not exactly as artless as the wanderer, the other person she's talking to, thinks it is, right? There is a reason for it. So she tells about this young man she has always loved. They had talked about marriage and their wedding day. And then in the next stanza, so she loved him like a brother. And, and I think back then that wasn't such a death knell to a relationship as it is today. So it's not as bad. Now, here's where, for me, it gets really confusing. I think it gets confusing possibly to everybody. And I think this is intentional. So it says that his father said that to a distant town he must repair to ply the artist's trade. So in other words, her lover's father says that that to a distant town he must repair to ply the artist's trade. So I think the father has to go, or the son has to go to ply the artist's trade. It wouldn't be a craftsman. What tears of bitter grief till then unknown. So, of course, this caused them to cry. What tender vows our last sad kiss delayed. So their marriage vows are delayed by this last sad kiss because he's leaving. To him we turned. Okay, who is him? It doesn't say. We had no other aid. So it's probably the father of her lover. Like one revived, upon his neck I wept, and her whom he had loved in joy, he said he well could love in grief. So he says, oh, I can love you in joy. I can love you even when I'm sad. His faith he kept. And in a quiet house once more my father slept. So she's still with him, we find out. 4 years each day. She lived with her new children, so on and so forth. So did the lover leave? We don't really get a clear idea if he did. And I think it's ambiguous on purpose in this story. I think, and her whom he had loved in joy, he said he well could love in grief. So he could love her in good times and in bad times. His faith he kept. So hopefully it means that he could stay. So it's possible what this is saying is that he did stay. And in a quiet house once more, my father slept. So I guess the only other way I could take that is that they finally figured something out with the husband. We don't know what they figured out. And they're not in their own house. They're in a quiet house, right? They lost the wife or the woman and her husband and her father lost their house, but they moved in with this other man. So that's the best way I can, I guess, take that. So maybe she did stay with the childhood friend that she had always loved. Okay, in the next stanza 10. So she had 4 children. She had, 4 years each day with daily bread was blessed, 3 lovely infants. So she had 3 children that lay upon her breast. And now we've moved forward in time in the narrative 4 years. But the father at this point dies. Her father dies and was saved from seeing the empty loom, cold hearth, and silent wheel. Now that is, again, another picture by Wordsworth of what was lost. So the way he really liked the harmonious way that peasants and the people lived their lives, where everyone contributed. And, so there was the loom, there was the hearth, there was where people told stories, there was the silent wheel. This is where they would, make garments, clothes, they can make things with this. And everybody came together. Even little children would help with certain aspects of, of this whole thing. So the loom and spinning wheel were crucial tools of the trade for hand loom weavers. Wordsworth's dismay over the decline of traditional cottage industries, and that's where the traditional cottage industry was, where individual cottager, people living in their homes, families worked basically on these things, and they would sell them in the marketplaces. And so later he expressed in a series of poems on the spinning wheel, included in poems he wrote called shorter poems. But here's what he says about this. I could write a treatise of lamentation upon the changes brought about among the cottages of Westmoreland by the silence of the spinning wheel. During long winter nights and wet days, the wheel upon which the wool was spun gave employment to a large part of a family. The old man, however infirm, was able to card the wool, as he sat in the corner by the fireside. And often when a boy have I admired the cylinders of carded wool, which were softly laid upon each other by his side. 2 wheels were often at work on the same floor, and others of the family, chiefly the little children, were occupied in teasing and cleaning the wool to fit it for the hand of the carder, so that all except the smallest infants were contributing to mutual support. Such was the employment that prevailed in the pastoral vales. So what he's saying there is that everyone was involved in this. It was a harmonious event. Now, there's a sense when we say, that you're romanticizing the past. This is what I think, this is where that's coming from. That idea of romanticizing the past comes from this kind of idea. Wordsworth here is romanticizing the idyllicness, the quaintness, the ease of that past. Now, he's not aware of what's going to happen where children will no longer work at all. But to him, a little bit of work is not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. A little bit of child labor is not necessarily a bad thing. And that was a general idea. Children always worked. That was just always the way it was. And they contributed, all but the littlest children. But that's what he is kind of reacting against. Okay, in the next stanza, stanza 11, she talks about, the narrator talks about how it was an evil time. The church never gave them any alms or relief, so the church did not help them. And then it gets worse. Calls to arms by the government took her husband away to war, and she, like others, flew to the coast. So my husband's arms now only serve to strain me and his children, hungering in his view. So he had to hold them back, and he had to, while he went off to volunteer to fight, either volunteer or he was taken. It's not, she doesn't tell the other person. It's not clear what's happening. And that's part of the artless story. We want to know, what did he volunteer for this? But either way, like, they were starving, he had to do something, and this is what he did. Whether he chose it or not is somewhat irrelevant. And that, I think, is the point. That, I think, is part of the point, that when you read this poem, you kind of want to know, well, wait, is it clear that she ended up with her husband, with the childhood friend? Is it clear that he volunteered? She's not spending a lot of time being clear about that, although she's very clear about other things. Like, she's clear that her husband dies when that happens. Like, it's not ambiguous that happens. It's not ambiguous that she all of a sudden has 3 children, but it is ambiguous what happened and how they got there. And I think that's, again, that's on purpose in the narrator, in that she is focusing on what to her was valuable and important. Who the husband was isn't as important as what was going on in her life. Right, the difficulties that she had to overcome. And her husband, whether he volunteered or not, he disappeared, right? In her mind, it doesn't matter if he volunteered, right? There's no clue, but soon with proud parade, the noisy drum beat round to sweep the streets of wanton pain, right? So they come around. This is after the church rejects them from getting any alms. My husband's arms now only serve to strain me and his children, hungering in his view. So he just he's restraining them. In such dismay, my prayers and tears were vain. To join those miserable men he flew. So it maybe he volunteered, but it doesn't say. Again, it doesn't say clearly if we're just reading this plainly. So he could have just joined them because he had no choice. But again, it doesn't matter if he volunteered or if he was recruited or enlisted against his will, like drafted. What matters is that he disappeared. He joined them. That's what matters to her, because he's gone. And now to the seacoast with numbers more we drew. So with all the families that of these men, she followed them to the coast. Okay, the next one. So she waits for a boat to America, because for months she and her children waited for her husband, and the British fleet remained docked or somewhere in that area. And then we get this line, the parting signal is the last line in stanza 12. The parting signal streamed, at last the land withdrew. And so they leave, right? Stanza 13, finally she gets on that ship during a storm. They cross, and waves were high as mountains. Many ships perished, but she survived. But from delay the summer calms were past. On as we drove the equinoctial deep, that's equinoct, ran mountains high before the howling blast. So again, in the stanza before, her husband and the British fleet left early, and she had to wait for another boat to follow him to America. We gazed with terror on the gloomy sleep of them that perished in the whirlwind sweep. So men who went down with their ship and died, the gloomy sleep. Untaught that soon such anguish must ensue. Our hopes such harvest of affliction reap, that we the mercy of the waves would rue. We reached the western world, a poor, devoted crew. So they made it. 14. Here we have her lament against the bloodshed of war, and in particular, a war of brothers. She is now following at the heels of war. It's a quote from Shakespeare. So she talks about the pains and plagues that on our heads came down, and disease and famine, agony and fear, right? And she talks about brain unsettled even to it would thy brain unsettle even to hear. So this is the hellish existence that she's in, and this is when she reveals the horrible moment of her life. All perished, all in one remorseless year. Husband and children, one, by sword and ravenous plague, all perished. Every tear dried up, despairing, desolate, on board a British ship I waked, as from a trance restored. So she has gone into a trance. She's so devastated that she doesn't even have the ability to cry anymore. It's gone. She can't do it. She's all cried out, basically. And she's back on the British ship. And on her return trip, the seas are quiet. And this is kind of a balm to her tortured soul. And it also reflects, peaceful as some immeasurable plain by the first beams of dawning light impressed. In the calm sunshine slept the glittering main. The very ocean has its hour of rest, that comes not to the human mourner's breast. Remote from man, and storms of mortal care, a heavenly silence did the waves invest. A heavenly silence did the waves invest. I looked and looked along the silent air, until it seemed to bring a joy to my despair. Ah, how unlike those late terrific sleeps and groans that rage of racking famine spoke, where looks inhuman dwelt on festering heaps, the breathing pestilence that rose like smoke, the shriek that from the distant battle broke, the mine's dire earthquake, and the pallid host driven by the bomb's incessant thunderstroke, to loathsome vaults where heartsick anguish tossed, hope died, and fear itself in agony was lost. So she's getting basically war flashbacks, but in this while she's on this journey home. Yet does that burst of woe congeal my frame. Again, she is transported in thought to another world, and then eventually she's landed in Britain. She has returned, but forever she has left behind hope and home. The best option for her is to wander alone, far from man. So this is some mighty gulf of separation past. I seem transported to another world. So remember that idea, the theme of traveling, right? So she is not only going on this, being evicted from the home that she had expected to be in her whole life, just like her father had. She expected to raise her kids there, to die in that land that was her father's hereditary nook. But instead, she's thrust out, she's shot like a cannon out in the world with her husband and her 3 children. And they all die. And then she returns, and there's like this turmoil, and she's kicked off her land, of course, and this man who came by, this industrialist. So it's this whole emotional journey, but it's also a physical journey. A thought resigned with pain, when from the mast the impatient mariner the sail unfurled, and whistling called the wind that hardly curled the silent sea. From the sweet thoughts of home and from all hope I was forever hurled. So she's no longer capable of being, at home, wherever she is. She's going to be wandering far from man. She has no home. She's truly the homeless. Stanza 20. Back on British soil, she is now completely alone despite being near 1,000 homes. She is homeless. If this is starting to sound a little bit like liberals, well, you're getting where this is coming from. And hopefully you can have a little bit of sympathy and if you're not on that side of, the homeless and taking care of them, hopefully you can at least get into the world view of what this woman is experiencing. All day my ready tomb the ocean flood. To break my dream the vessel reached its bound. She got home. And homeless near 1,000 homes I stood, and near 1,000 tables pined and wanted food. So on her first day back, this is stanza 21, she ate no food and was too afraid to ask for help. She lay by an old outhouse. Still, the next day she could not make herself a beggar either. Stanza 22, again, a second and third day passed hence. Then in desperation, she tries for help. She goes to a crowd. She saw a fort, but arriving there, she collapses. And from, her vitals are collapsing. She's dizzy and she's taken to a hospital. So it goes, near the seaside, I reached a ruined fort. There, pains which nature could no more support. Now, if you remember where Wordsworth is, he is in, when he's inspired by this, he's actually walking in Salisbury Plain. Salisbury Plain is famous for its ancient relics of civilizations that have lived there, even Stonehenge, where there's these mysterious, creations of ancient men who are working together for some purpose, and we don't know what that purpose was. So she's by this kind of ruined fort. There, pains which nature could no more support, with blindness linked, did on my vitals fall. Dizzy my brain with interruption short of hideous sense. I sunk, nor step could crawl, and thence was borne away to neighboring hospital. Okay, so 23. She recovered as she finally was fed. Her brain was still marred, for she had no memories. And this is going to be an important part right here. So she doesn't remember herself. Remember that. I heard my neighbors in their beds complain of many things which never troubled me. Now, there's two ways you could take that, but let's see what she's saying here. Of feet still bustling round with busy glee. What does that mean? We're talking about horses, goats, little rats, children, right? So she's at this hospital. She sees these people and they have their families around them. Like these people in their hospital beds, sick. And their family is attending to them, which was a common thing back then. I mean, it's still common. We come to them too. But oftentimes your family might help out with nursing duties because of, the money issue and how impoverished everyone might have been or was. But she doesn't remember the feet bustling around. Or another way of taking it is she never remembered it troubling her. She never remembered being troubled by looks where common kindness had no part. Right? So it's more than common kindness. It's more than services done to one another. And then in the family that loves the patient, every moan would make a dead man start, because it affects you so much. It's when you hear your loved one moan in pain, it hurts your soul in a sense. So it fretting the fever round the languid heart, and groans, which as they said, would make a dead man start. Stanza 24. These things just serve to stir the torpid sense, nor pain nor pity in my bosom raised. So basically, the sight of these things, right, the families, stir her from her torpor, which is a physical and mental inactivity. Her memory returns, and the hospital dismisses her. Again, she wanders alone. She discovers a band of gypsies who give her food and rest and invite her to their group. So basically, at houses men in common, dismissed again an unopened day, I gazed at houses men in common light, amazed the lanes I sought, and as the sun retired, came where beneath the trees a faggot blazed. So that's a bundle of sticks, right? And so there's these bundle of sticks are on fire, and the wild brood. So that's the gypsies. The wild brood saw me weep. My fate inquired. So they asked how she was doing. And then they gave her food and rest and more welcome, which was much desired. 25, she talks about how she was touched by their kindness. How beautifully did they paint their lives? All belong to all. It's kind of this communal perfection, this utopia. Right? And my heart is touched to think that men like these, the rude earth's tenants, were my first relief. Now, stanza 26. So again, she's kind of staying with these utopian people, these gypsies that wander from town to town. They don't work very hard. They kind of just loaf around and enjoy life, enjoy living. And somehow they get milk from the udder, and they get, nature's meads, and they get grain and such, even though they don't really seem to work that hard. How they do it, we don't really know yet, but she's going to find out. Okay, so we're getting some more visualizations of the idyllic life again. Semblance with straw and panniard ass they made, of potters wandering on from door to door. So this is a picture which is often used in romantic paintings and paintings of this era, of a donkey, and a worker, a gypsy worker going around, kind of living off the land. The life of happier sort to me portrayed, and other joys my fancy to allure. The bagpipe dining on the midnight moor, so you can picture someone playing a bagpipe, and barn uplighted, and companions boon, well met from far with revelry secure, in depth of forest glade, when jocund June rolled fast along the sky was warm and genial moon. Okay, the next stanza. But soon the gypsy life, the wanderers, did not suit her. Primarily, she could not handle their thievery, and the life of the night she was raised to be, because she was raised to be good. Besides, there were fresh troubles still bothering her. So there's a myriad of reasons, but she leaves them. She says, but ill it suited me in journey dark over moor and mountain, midnight theft to hatch. Right? So these are brigands. They're not just gypsies, they're also brigands. They're thieves. They charm the surly house dog's faithful bark, or hang on tiptoe at the lifted latch. Right? They tiptoe to latch open the window to break in. The gloomy lantern and the dim blue match. The black disguise, so they dressed in black so they couldn't be seen. The warning whistle, shrill, so they have little whistles to each other to tell each other, someone's coming, and they whistle, and then everyone runs away. An ear still busy on its nightly watch, were not for me, brought up in nothing ill. Besides, on grief so fresh my thoughts were brooding still. So we're coming to the end of the poem, by the way, but she's gone on this journey, taken in consideration. She went to the hospital, she wandered around some more, she found this gypsy. We have another view of this kind of lifestyle. And if you know anything about, again, Victor Hugo, he has a book called Notre Dame de Paris, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And the gypsies play a prominent role here. And he's not pulling this out of nowhere. He's getting this from the atmosphere, heavily influenced by William Wordsworth. This was a very important poem. Okay. Number 28. We're on stanza 28. She left the gypsies, but could go nowhere. Not to her father's friends, for he had none left alive. There was little help from her husband's friends. She was too ill to work, so by the side of the road did she sit and weep. In the next stanza, then she lived by the mercy of the fields. Sometimes she won food, and other times she did not. There too she slept, but she is troubled most not by the afflictions of body, but of her inner self. Long gone was that sweet soul of her youth. So I lived upon the mercy of the fields, and oft the cruelty the sky accused. On hazard, or what general bounty yields, now coldly given, now utterly refused. The fields I for my bed have often used. But what afflicts my peace with keenest ruth, that's sorrow. Ruth is sorrow. So what afflicts my peace with sorrow is that I have my inner self abused. Foregone the home delight of constant truth, and clear and open soul, so prized in fearless youth. So now we get the real problem of all this in Wordsworth's mind, is it's not, obviously all the values that she lost were horrific. But one of the real reasons that this all occurred was that the constant truth of thousands of years that she lived in, that, she lived in this structure of thousands of years, that was all wiped out with this new coming changes that were going on. The new industrialization, that the mansion that bought up all the cottages and forced her father off her land, and the imaginary lines that were drawn that made it so he couldn't fish in certain areas. And then the war that drew her into this war that she, had no effect on her. It didn't really matter to her that the American colonies broke off. And yet it destroyed her life, and it destroyed that North Star of her inner world. Everything was gone. She was so prized in fearless youth. So she foregone the home delight of constant truth. Constant truth was gone. Her whole life, the world around her disappeared. It emptied. And that's the tragedy to Wordsworth. That's one of the deep tragedies. Of course, it's terrible, all the things that happen, and that's important too. But it's also terrible that she can't pick up the pieces because her truth is gone. Everything she ever knew is gone. It's all destroyed from these new changes. In the last stanza, we get 3 years of wander. Often have I viewed in tears the sun towards the country tend, where my poor heart lost all its fortitude. Right. So she's still basically she's wrapping up her story with the other interlocutor, the other person that's at Stonehenge with her. And she says, I've been wandering here since that moment of leaving the gypsies and crying on the side of the road. I've wandered for 3 more years. And often have I viewed in tears the sun toward that country tend where my poor heart lost all its fortitude. So I've often watched it over my home, the sun, drop over my home, and I can't go home. And now across this moor, right, Stonehenge, my steps I bend. Oh, tell me whither, tell me where, for no earthly friend have I. So tell me where I'm supposed to go. Because she has no earthly friend, she has nothing. And here we get the last 4 lines are of the other wanderer. She ceased, and weeping turned away, as if because her tale was at an end. She wept, because she had no more to say of that perpetual weight which on her spirit lay. And again, I hope you're starting to see the role of what romanticism is, and what Wordsworth is trying to do. He's taking a tale that he was familiar with. He knew a little bit of himself. He had been kicked out of his own home as a child. His parents died. He had been abandoned. And, so I think it's not a coincidence that he writes about abandoned women and children quite often in his poetry. And the thing that he adds to it is not only the beauty of the language itself, which is a big part of it, of course, and it's the accessibility of the language, which reflects the kind of Enlightenment era that he's coming at, that everybody should be reading great poetry, not just a certain select few rich people who can afford the most expensive colleges in the world, but that everybody has the ability to read and to access important thoughts. But he's also trying to order or have an understanding of, he's like trying to trace this inner world of this woman. How does somebody experience the world? How does a character experience the world when their North Star is taken from them, shucked out into the universe, away in a direction that they have no understanding of where it went? And that's what happened to this young lady. She lost everything. Her North Star is gone, and she no longer knows where to go and what to do. And her, again, as she put it, but what afflicts my peace with keenest sorrow is that I have my inner self abused. She's been abused in her inner self. So she, again, is always going to be alone her whole. She's worse than dead in a certain sense. She's homeless. At least to the believers of God that Wordsworth and the men of this time were, the deceased had somewhere to go. She was completely destitute. Nothing. And this is part of, a major strain in the romantic art of this time, is to look at these characters, to see their world. Jean Valjean of Les Miserables is exactly like that kind of character. We're really investigating his life and the difficulties that these changes are having on, ordinary men like that. Or even though he's not exactly ordinary, but extraordinary men like that, but how they survive and transform and are forced to make their way in this new world that has turned its back on them. Okay, so that's The Female Vagrant. Hopefully the title means something to you now. The Female Vagrant, right? The gypsies are vagrant, and she's a vagrant. Now, a vagrant, by the way, does just mean archaically a wanderer, but it also means, a person without a settled home or regular work, who wanders from place to place and lives by begging. But we need to see why they became that. That's what he's trying to show, is we need to look at what's causing that kind of vagrancy. And his argument in this is that it's these new penal laws, these new codes, ways of doing things where you could take away the land that these people have lived on their entire lives. Which when you think about it, even if you are a pro-industrialist person like me, it should still strike you as, well, what do you do with someone who's lived there their whole lives and has a certain way of doing things? I mean, we had, the Homestead Act in America, where if you worked the land for a certain amount of time, then it was yours. Well, these people had worked the land for long enough. Why wasn't it theirs? I mean, that's a tricky situation. How do you just kick them out by law? And that seems to be a serious problem, and it also seems to be what led to a lot of turmoil. Now, I'm not a scholar of the history of 1700s in terms of Britain and France and all the things that led up to the French Revolution, but that is a part of it. I'm quite confident that that's a part of what's going on, is that these types of things are occurring. Not to mention that the kings and the queens and Marie Antoinette's type people are getting richer and richer, and there's these scandals going on that's really infuriating the people that are starving to death, essentially. Okay, so anyway, that's The Female Vagrant. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time.